Our final discussion today, thrilled to introduce, connecting where we live, work, and learn, creating spaces and places where opportunities for connection thrive. So again, I want to just take a moment and remind ourselves, the Foundation for Social Connection and the Scientific Leadership Council there developed this social framework, which is a structural approach to addressing social isolation and loneliness in a comprehensive way. Our policy priorities, all 120, over 120 of them, and recommendations for the Congress are structured around the social framework. Okay. And our discussions today are also structured around the social framework. So I just wanted to remind ourselves of why we're looking at all these different areas. It is grounded in research, it's grounded in data, and it's grounded in science. Okay. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce Jillian Huson, who is right here. And Jillian is our executive director of the Foundation for Social Connection. And Jillian, I'm going to turn it right over to you. Welcome.
Come up as well. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you. So great to be here with you all. I'm actually going to go a little rogue, which I think every panelist wants to hear. We are going to start just with a moment of connection so that we can walk the walk in addition to talking the talk, right? So I just want to give everyone a moment to turn to the person next to them, maybe one or two people near you. I'm going to set a timer for 2 minutes. I want you all to try to find two things in common that are not the obvious, right? How we look. So ready, set, and go. Find someone and find two things in common. All right, let me call it. All right, everyone. We are coming back. All right, we're gonna come back now. Thank you so much. I also should have said like stretch during that. You could stand during that. So if you need a moment to stretch, take it. Anyone want to share? Any good commonalities we found? Tanya and I are both middle children, and we fit the bill. So that was that. Anyone else want to share? Yeah.
Well, food. Something like raw food. There was a commonality, but you know, I like Southeast Asian food, African and South American. Yeah, I don't think so.
We all agree on Southeast.
Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Right there with you. Anyone else want to? Offer something?
Morgan Foundation. Mishka and I like to hike, we like to dance,
Nice.
and we like to cook. And your oldest daughter and oldest granddaughter.
Oh. Overachiever, you found like 5 things. Okay, great. Well, I hope that was good just to have a moment for us to connect in the room. I'm sure after this panel as well, we'll have more connecting time. Just really want to thank the Action Network for having me and this, wonderful event here for Global Loneliness Awareness Week. I'm so excited to introduce our panelists, and I'm really going to let them introduce themselves a little bit. But Katie Adamson, Vice President of Health Partnerships and Policy, the YMCA of USA. Dr. Constance Noonan Hadley, founder of the Institute for Life at Work and Associate Professor for Boston University Western School of Business, and Dr. Loren Cox, Policy Director, Aspen Institute's Education and Society Program. So thank you all so much for being here. And I really just wanted to start by giving each of you a moment to kind of help us set the stage, a little bit about your work, your background, and what brings you to the world of social connection. Sure, go ahead, Connie.
We're not in the order that we were introduced, so I am Connie Hadley. I'm an organizational psychologist, which basically means I study people at work, and I am really fascinated by what life is like at work and trying to improve it. And I didn't start out looking at loneliness. This has been a research area for the last 5 years or so that I've been exploring. But what I did start off back in my doctoral program 25 years ago was studying how do people who have really tough jobs survive in those jobs without burning out. And I had, at one point, there was a fork in the woods, and I almost became a clinical therapist. Decided to go into organizational psychology instead, but one of the groups of people that I studied for my dissertation were people like therapists. How do they do that without burning out? The thing that I didn't do. Or emergency room physicians, or guardian ad litems, or social workers, or I talked to a nun. And what I found through that research is that the number one reason why those people could sustain those difficult human service jobs that are so important was through social support. And specifically social support at work. And there are a lot of reasons why people who do those jobs rely on their friends and family outside, but they can't talk to them about their work. Whether it's a HIPAA violation explicitly, or just they need to leave their work at home to be able to decompress. And so what happens to all that stuff during the workday that comes up, the emotions that come from that work? It was by talking with their colleagues who really understood the work, who could support them in that work. And so that was really the trajectory I was on. I was looking at social support. How do we increase social support? And over time, it turned out the more people I talked to, the more people I found who didn't have it. They didn't have social support. They were, in fact, feeling quite adrift in organizations. And that's when I pivoted to deeply trying to understand this epidemic of loneliness in the workplace. And then with the pandemic, of course, the attention to this issue only skyrocketed. So that's how I come to you today, is somebody who's really trying to get us back to the social support side of work, but needing to deal with this issue of loneliness first.
Hi, I'm Loren Cox. I'm the policy director for the Aspen Institute's Education and Society Program. I definitely do not have as direct of a line in my past to now as Connie did. I'm a lawyer by training and then went to policy school to do my PhD, but have this longstanding interest in young people. I was a criminal defense attorney for juveniles when I was practicing, and then went into my policy program and quickly transitioned into education policy, just because of the recognition that, one, it made a difference in my life. I was a first generation college graduate, but also recognizing that the large majority of our young people are going to pass through our education system. And whatever we're doing there has an impact for them as an individual, at the community level, at the workplace level, and ultimately for our country and our democracy. And so over time, then thinking about the different opportunities that young people have to either have connection or not, and how that impacts them both in the short term, like young people standing in front of a courtroom with me who've been accused of some type of crime. Or in the long term, when we think about launching successful lives for our young people. And that work in kind of a winding way brought me to the Ed and Society program, where we think a lot about and kind of what undergirds all of our work is what is the primary purpose of public education? And we've landed on 3 things. One is developing a healthy sense of self. The second is preparing to be successful in your workforce. And then the third is making sure that you are a participant in civic life in your community, in your country. And connection is actually incredibly important to all 3 of those things. And so connected to that work, we've launched some research and some work around the importance of belonging in schools. And if you look at the research, and I know we'll get into it more, but about how it is actually like both core and interdependent to a lot of the things that we think about as the purpose. We often think about it as being able to read and do math, which I'm squarely in the camp that schools should be making sure kids can read and do math. But it has to be in this way that makes them feel like they are connected both to the people in the building and to this like longer, deeper purpose for them in the future. So that's what kind of brings me to this work.
Katie Adamson, I'm Vice President of Health Partnerships and Policy at the Y. Have a background on the Hill and at the CDC in Atlanta, but I've been at the Y for 21 years. I think their story is more interesting than mine. I think if people put some names on me, they'd say problem solver, fixer, educator, advocate. So that's kind of what I come to the work with. The Y turns 175 next year. Most people don't know the history of the YMCA. And we're really kind of going back to our origin story with this work. But we came together to help young men who've moved to industrial cities have a safe place to live, to connect socially and to solve the greatest social needs they saw in their community through spirit, mind, and body work. That's sort of a consistent thing throughout the Y's history. We have continued to have that model replicated over time when there have been great societal challenges. So during World War I and World War II, we won the Nobel Peace Prize for our work during wartime for brotherly love. We went overseas and took care of 6 million prisoners of war. When Americans were put in internment camps, we snuck on site and brought programs to the children because some of our Y staff were in there and said the kids were dying. They had no social way to play or anything like that. So the Y got on site and did that. In flash forward to modern day today, we're in 10,000 communities. We have 2,600 Ys, 17 million people of all ages are served through the Y. And we were called to the Hill in 2004 and asked how we're going to solve the obesity epidemic. And we built a really great model called Pioneering Healthier Communities, which was a community change model to try to address policy systems and environments to make built environments have access to healthy, available, affordable food and physical activity. That model made 37,000 changes impacting policy changes impacting 73 million lives. Well, we are dusting off that model. Our Ys have asked us to bring it back. They loved it so much. They want that model to come to the table to deal with social isolation and loneliness. So I'm going to stop there. But to say that, at the end of the day, the Y wants to develop everyone's full health and human potential and solve society's greatest needs. Woo!
Well, I might throw it right back to you actually, Katie.
Okay.
But just, thank you for sharing about the history, and it really feels that social connection has been integral, right, and vital to the mission of the Y since the beginning. And I'm curious if you could just share a little bit more about, as we've been talking about third spaces and spaces, the Y is definitely one of those that's really key to our communities. So how is the Y, really focusing on social connection and thinking about fostering social connection in communities today?
Right, so I think that the Y is definitely a third space. We're also a microcosm of everything we've talked about today. So the Y is the single largest nonprofit provider of childcare, after school, youth sports, camping, swim instruction, and other things. Evidence-based chronic disease prevention programs, and one of the largest provider of food programs for hungry kids. And so we have 6.6 million kids that are coming to one facet of those programs. And I think when they come to those programs naturally, they're finding their spark. They're making friendships and they're building bonds. We have 4 million adults over 55 in the Y. We have senior social clubs, senior outing programs, meals where they gather. And through those opportunities, many of our seniors either find an opportunity for volunteering, serving on an advisory board capacity, and we're gonna do a whole lot more of that with our older adults now, recognizing the need. And then also actually becoming staff again and getting rehired to deliver the programs. We have 250,000 individuals that come to the Y for chronic disease programming, evidence-based chronic disease programming, and intentionally built in peer support into that model. So Live Strong at the YMCA is a cancer survivorship program. I'm an individual who lives with arthritis. We have an enhanced fitness program for that. You come into a room with people who are struggling with the same, often invisible condition, not necessarily with cancer, but certainly with arthritis, and you're able to share the struggles, but also the successes in that environment. And then 3 million food insecure kids last year got 57 million meals at the YMCA. And through that, they're in a congregate setting, getting enrichment programming. They're not identified as food insecure. So they're seen and heard as someone other than a kid that's hungry. And our volunteers have become critical in that effort, in that they're building bonds and seeing what's actually going on in the community, having a deeper empathy and understanding for what's happening in our country with kids and the need for nourishment. So I think that naturally we already do that. It's built into our DNA, but we're going to be much more intentional and are working on that now towards social isolation and loneliness.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, turning to the workplace, I wanted to just touch on, how does social isolation and loneliness really impact our ability to thrive at work? And as we think about, screening and identification has been brought up a lot today, really in the context of the healthcare sector and healthcare settings. So I'm thinking about in workplace settings, how are you thinking about identifying and screening for loneliness?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll just throw some more numbers at you in terms of thinking about the economic impact of loneliness at work. We've had estimates from Cigna here that says American employers lose $154 billion a year due to loneliness at work. The UK government has done similar types of cost estimates. So it has a really big economic impact, and I'll explain why, and I think that it helps illustrate what it means to be lonely at work. The first one is the healthcare impact. So we've already heard from Dr. Nobel and others about how much people are affected physically by being lonely. So if you're an employer and you're paying healthcare reimbursement for your employees, that's a drain on your economics right there. But also people just don't show up at work as much. So you have more absenteeism. We also know, and my research shows this over and over again, people tend to quit more. So you have higher turnover costs, so the cost of recruiting and replacing your employees. And then for those who do stay on the job and show up at work, you tend to have lower productivity rates, because people just aren't as engaged, and they also don't have the social support. Again, this is a really critical factor here to do their jobs well over time. So for example, in some of my research, we see the job satisfaction rates are like 41% lower, intention to quit is 46% higher. So, whether employees are sitting there and not doing their best work, or whether they're absent due because of medical illness or because they just can't really bear to show up to work that day, it has a huge impact. And I've really tried to emphasize that to employers, that it's in their best interest if they want a healthy and thriving workforce to address this issue. So how do they do that? One of the first things I say is you've got to start measuring it. And there are different ways to do that. My colleague Sarah Wright from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, and I have a 5-question scale that we've validated that can be used. We've made it publicly available for anyone who wants to use it for non-commercial purposes. And one of the key questions that we ask as part of that scale is, do you have enough people at work who would have your back if you needed support? And that question alone, we found, has really highlighted to people where they stand. Because one of the reasons to measure it is not just so you can track change over time with the interventions that we hope you'll make, but also because people often don't recognize it in themselves. And I don't know, because I don't study people outside of work, if that's the case elsewhere, but I do know at work it's definitely true. that I'll talk to people and they'll say, I don't like my job. I don't like this, I don't like my manager, I don't like the type of work I do. But when you drill down, it's that they feel like they just don't have anybody there who has their back, that they're kind of invisible. They're unseen, you know, they're unheard, they're not really valued at work. And they don't think of that as loneliness, but that essentially is what they're saying. And so that's one of the reasons we promote asking questions like the ones we offer, the other ones available, because until you get people to really start thinking about this explicitly and tracking it, you'll often miss the problem.
Yeah, and it brings me, you know, of course, to our youth, right? And thinking about you talked about preparing them for the workforce and thinking about this connection to purpose outside of maybe learning math and science and all the important things, reading, writing, but that connection to belonging to your community, civic engagement, your purpose in life. And so just curious your thoughts around you know, how schools can be places of thriving for students. And why it's really critical to start these, you know, practices of pro-social behavior in school from a young age.
I always, when I'm talking about belonging or connection, like to situate it, and I don't think that anyone in this room believes that connection is unimportant. But often when I'm in spaces, especially when we're talking about students who are like furthest from opportunity, people try to describe it as something that's like on the margins, right? But this idea that social connection is actually a basic student need, including belonging. And so there's this great clip on the Netflix documentary about David Beckham, who I know is not a young person, but I promise I'll get to your point. When he switched teams, right? This is a gentleman who is world renowned, the best at his craft, probably does have passion and purpose, and certainly has resources. And it talked about how difficult it was when he made the transition outside of his home team. Because all of a sudden he couldn't speak the language, his family wasn't there, his community wasn't there. And so it's just such a good highlight on how it is essential for everyone to feel that way. And I think it becomes even more critical when you're going through the development stages for young people. And school is often where they do that. They do it at home, they do it at school, they do it with community partnerships throughout the country. But a huge part of their day is spent in the classroom or in the school building. I have a 5-year-old, and earlier this week he said, well, you know, Mom, I really am with my friends at school sometimes more than I'm with you. Right, and that like highlights how important it is. But right now we have about 40% of students who report that they don't feel connected to schools. And so those are millions of students across the country, and we know that it matters because if you look at connection and belonging, they're often better predictors than some of the other things that we often talk about in terms of attendance, which right now we have a huge chronic absenteeism issue, in terms of their likelihood to graduate, their likelihood to pursue post-secondary opportunities, their academic achievement actually is often increased, as well as like they're more likely to launch what we would say is a successful or thriving life. And so thinking about the ways that schools can build connection is, I think, inherent to the individuals who are often in a classroom that has mostly not been a strategy in the way that it should when we think about other goals that we have of schools. And so not to sound, not to echo, but one of the things that we talk a lot about is what are you measuring? People pay attention to the things that you measure. There's lots of good measurements around whether young people feel connected to their school or not. One of the most important ways is to ask them, right? And it's been shown to be reliable and valid over and over again, but we have a real tension sometimes about asking young people and trusting what they're saying about these institutions that they're in, including schools. And so ask young people, do they feel connected? Do they have one person in the building that they could go to have their back or to support them? And I think the flip of that is we've also seen schools that they track it too. You know, I have this one principal in my mind that has all the academic measures of her students up on one side, and on the other is every single student's name, and she asks her teachers and her school staff every week. Is there at least one person in this room, the adults, that knows something about each of these students on the board? And so thinking about how, and when there's not, that's a highlight, right? And then they can think about interventions. And so it really is a place that we have to more strategically think about connection and belonging. It's the focus on strong teacher relationships, collaborative learning opportunities, That's when you get in there and get with your friends, and I don't mean group work where the takeaway is like no one does their job. I had to do it all, right? You hear that a lot about group work, but we need them to get in and be problem solving together. And then thinking about their extracurriculars and the breadth of activities that we can offer in partnership with other folks, because schools cannot bear the full burden of all that we're talking about. To give people all types of opportunities, do I want to be on the baseball team? Do I want to be at an arts program? My kid's school has a Legos program and a Minecraft program, right? They have these really like a really diverse set of interests to start giving kids the opportunity to build that leadership identity that helps them feel like they're connected to both themselves and something larger than themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I guess I'll just share anecdotally, I went to a new school my freshman year and I remember being, 14, 15 years old and walking into this huge school coming from a small school. And I think in the first week I met with like my guidance counselor and I walk into her office and take a seat. And I saw her glance at the computer to see my name. And for some reason, it just stuck with me like the whole day and don't think about it now clearly. But it just made me think, she doesn't know me. No one knows me. And of course, now I have a bit more understanding of, probably that was the potentially 20th person they had seen that day, and there's a lot of people, students to manage and to support. But it does stick with you. And so it kind of leads me to my question about barriers. Before we get to a bit more around solutions, I'm curious if each of you can talk a little bit more about barriers to social connection that you see at work, in schools and in community settings such as the Y. Whoever wants to take it first.
Short ones only. I think individuals lack trust and confidence today, and I think a lot of it is our political environment. So we do have a Team Up initiative at the Y, you can look it up, where we're trying to build those, bridge build with Habitat for Humanity, Catholic Charities, and Interfaith America. I think too often we expect people to come to us. I heard that earlier on a panel. So the Y has some Y on the Fly and Wise on Wheels, where we actually take food and physical activity into community because people can't all come to us. I think there's a lack of investment of resources in multi-sector partnerships, like some of the ones that were mentioned earlier this morning, community-based programming and the physical spaces that we need to actually be able to do this work. And I have some policy ideas around that later. So one more, just health systems, I think, have yet to adopt enough social connectedness as a covered service, maybe with the exception of Medicare Advantage, but is it being used enough? And then Medicaid managed care, I think, starting to see this, but could do more.
So I would +1 on a lot of that, probably all of it. And then add to the piece around trust. The thing that we see is young people don't actually have the opportunity to interact with people across lines of difference. So we talk a lot about in politics that we have swing states. We don't really have that many swing communities, right? Like once you get down to the local level, they're actually quite homogenous. And when you get down to the school level, they're incredibly homogenous in most places. And so thinking about how to just create opportunities to even do that bridging work is a current challenge. But more broadly, I think it's time and capacity, both of parents and of students. And that kind of intertwines with what our competing priorities are. We have in education, we've created this dichotomy of like, you care about math or reading, or you care about the socio-emotional skills of children. The research doesn't support that at all, but it is still how we talk about it. And so when it comes up, it often is like, well, as a teacher, how am I supposed to focus on belonging if I also have to make sure that they are reading and doing math? And so I think just getting better about how the two are intertwined, how they are not separate things that you're going after, but that they are things that are interdependent on one another. And that's related to also like, how are we measuring it and talking about it to re-incentivize? I think there's just some physical and organizational constraints sometimes. Connecting across youth serving organizations with schools is really difficult. It's often difficult even within a school to kind of make those cross connection opportunities. I also think about the way that we tackle teacher prep programs. Like they very rarely have any type of interdisciplinary work with the psychology department, where we're talking about youth, adolescents, youth development in a way that we talk about how we prepare young people. And so just the siloed nature of organization seems to be a real barrier. And then the economic stress that a lot of like individuals are feeling, to where, you know, not to say it's so simple, but they're like, I don't have time to worry about feelings. And that schools are feeling right now, right? Like the stress on their finances, and they're having to think about how do they even do the basic functions, much less do this broader work around connection and belonging.
So I really think about loneliness as context specific. And by that I mean, I'm really studying work loneliness. The fact is, people can be lonely at work and then not lonely at home. They can have a wonderful, thriving experience outside the workplace. So what does that tell you? It tells you that it's something about the work environment itself that's making people lonely. The way work is designed, the culture that's there, the social norms that are present. So I think the biggest barrier is just trying to help leaders understand that. I gave a talk to a pharmaceutical company about loneliness, and at the end of it, the CEO said to me, all right, Connie, I get that it's a problem, but why is it my problem? And fair question. I said, well, you know, I'm not saying it has to be your problem, but rather than thinking about this as some kind of burden or extra onus on you, why don't you think about it as an opportunity? I mean, you actually have the levers at your disposal to change this. And for the reasons I mentioned before, financially, I think you will benefit from it in the long run. But people just don't connect that. They don't think of loneliness as something that can be caused by their environment. It seems to be still thought of as this personal issue. And so that's the first thing I would say needs to change in terms of organizational loneliness, is how can we get people to understand that collectively we're creating this problem? It's not this one employee's problem. The other thing that I would say, start thinking about what are those triggers that are creating this. And one of the ones that I study is just looking at the pace of work and the productivity focus. And the more we try to squeeze every second of every day towards something productive, the more we have the risk of crowding out social connection. Because still, people don't, as you were saying, connect the dots to know this is not a do your work or connect situation. It's not an either or. You actually connect while you're doing the work if you design it a certain way. And so instead, people think that you know, that's something that they must do after hours, if they go to a happy hour or do something else. Like, this is not something that happens during the workday. But if you slow down the pace or you change the way people work together, you can actually create that and embed it throughout. But nonetheless, if people are super stressed and they have like a 10-hour day ahead of them, then yes, they're probably not going to take as many moments to sit and ask someone, how are you? Or ask one of those great questions that you were talking about, you know, what brings you joy? They won't do that if they feel like there's this specter of time management hanging over their head that says, no, this is not a good use of time. So that's a big one to look at. Another one I look at is how teams are designed. So teams could be a great solution to loneliness if they're designed well, because everyone thinks, oh, well, if you're on a team, then you're already part of the community, you belong to each other. But the reality is that we've also really hyper efficiency, that's not a word, but the way teams are designed. So if you think about it now, oftentimes people are stacked on multiple teams at once so that they are never like idle. That means they have fewer moments to interact with one group. They're not part of a core team. And think about if you were playing on 5 baseball teams instead of 1 baseball team, how close would you feel to that team? Also thinking about the way that we are compressing the timelines of teams. So now I don't know, I'm really gonna go with this baseball theme. I have 4 sons, they all play baseball, so I guess I'll go with it. But you know, think about instead of like, you know, a 3 or 4 month season, now you have 2 or 3 weeks as a team before you move on to your next team. And that's how a lot of agile teams, scrum teams, for example, are designed. So we're really sort of creating we're squeezing out opportunities for people, especially people who may be introverted or new or younger or from different background, to get to know each other. That does take some time and repeated contact points. So if our work doesn't enable those, I think we're going to continue to see this loneliness epidemic continue.
Yeah, thank you, each of you, for talking about the barriers. And I think, you know, Connie, really glad you talked about leadership first, because I think, you know, especially as we look at the Surgeon General 6 pillars to advance social connection. Number 6 is building a culture of connection, and that really starts with leadership. And part of the reason that we, developed the social framework and brought all these sectors together is so that every sector of society can start to see themselves as a part of the solution for advancing social connection. So, of course, starting with our workplace leaders, school leaders, community center leaders, and then making sure we're building that same pro-social behavior across our teams. I want to just double click a little bit on the workplace because I know it's been a hot topic just thinking about remote work, hybrid, virtual environments that we're working in. I'm curious if you have thoughts or if your research has shown any impacts on how virtual environments are impacting our ability to connect with one another.
We've been looking at it a lot. We get a lot of questions even now, and companies are still trying to figure out their office versus remote policies. And what I will speak just to the research that I and my colleagues have done on this, I will say that the bottom line is that remote work can be a risk factor for loneliness if it's 100% remote. That's what our data shows. So the people who never ever see their colleagues in person in our studies have shown to be slightly higher loneliness. Not all of our studies, by the way, and it's not a huge effect, but it is there. However, we also have very little evidence to say that 5 days in the week is the magic number, that people need 100% time in person. There's no difference in most of our research between someone who goes to the office 1 or 2 days a week and someone who goes 5 days. So I also, when I have the opportunity to talk to leaders, say to them, like, stop using social connection as the excuse to haul everybody back in 5 days a week. Where's the data on that? And maybe individual companies have their own data that would say that. And I can see there could certainly be that possibility depending on the type of work that they're doing. But, overall, there's much more nuance than that. It's really how people connect whatever mode they're in that matters. So there are lots of ways to connect very, very effectively remotely. One of my closest colleagues that I've worked with for 3 years, I've never met in person. But we know each other about each other's children, each other's families, our histories together, because we spend a lot of time together online and we carve out time in our conversations to get to know each other. So in person is wonderful. And I love seeing all these people, meeting all of you on the panel in person. So I'm not saying that's also something we should always avoid, but let's be a little bit more discreet about how we think about the modes that we're in. Let's do the best we can when people are together to set them up for connection. And then let's do the best we can when they're remote to also facilitate connection. You can have it both ways.
Thank you. I want to move, we talked a little bit about barriers. I want to move to a bit more, solution-oriented part of the conversation. And we know that segments of the population are more at risk, right, for social isolation and loneliness. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the populations you work with and how you might, as you're crafting, interventions or you're thinking about solutions, how you're thinking about those different segments of the population. And I think, in particular, I'm curious about when you are kind of building those tailored approaches, what positive outcomes are you seeing?
So I'm gonna lean in on teens and older adults. So we've got practice leaders at the Y that have cohorts across the country, like learning labs, and we use human-centered design principles, Institute for Healthcare Improvement Strategies, innovation, program design institutes to try to ask people what they want and then design it, not just decide to design it for them. So anyway, North Carolina had a lot of Ys involved in that, and then they went after some funding in the state for mental health. They had a study come out that showed kids got an F in mental health, and there was 10% of the kids reported having attempted suicide. 20% reported being severely depressed. And so that gave the impetus for the state to actually fund something. So they gave the Y some money. The Y trained up over 400 youth mental health facilitators and put them at Ys across the country, had the youth help them design a resiliency hub and a campaign that went with it. It was called Feel It, Face It Together. The kids were able to paint with a screen a QR code all over the state for this hub for kids. These facilitators referred over 100 kids that were in crisis to mental health counselors. We used Hello Insight to do pre and post test over the summer to see what kind of healthy behaviors, protective factors, resiliency was built within the Y. And they have core social emotional learning measures. And 96%, 97% of over 550 kids that were looked at, teens, had meaningful growth in at least one of 5 core areas: academic, self-efficacy, contribution, positive identity, self-management, and social skills. But 36% of them made significant progress in all of them. And so I think what we were trying to do is overlay this innovative model with a lot of strategies to the programming and see if we were effective inside at creating those kind of connections and the buffers against challenges. With older adults, we are creating a tool that'll be really flexible for WISE. We had a tool just before the pandemic, and it kind of shut down that process. So we dusted it off and we decided to make it more flexible. And we're having WISE think about everything from the principals inside their facilities to programming, partnerships, and policy, and all sorts of ideas about how to think about that. And a recognition that this population, while they're older adults, in no way has the same abilities, interests, or life experiences, and to stop thinking of people as seniors, but to think of them as adults and individuals with a lot to contribute, to design boards where they can serve, to help them inform what the Y looks like from bigger lettering and everything else. So I think there's a whole bunch of that's going to go on with that, and one of these as part of that new launch of a kind of creating connective communities initiative that we're going to kick off next year with our birthday, this is going to be an innovation test for us with older adults, using all these new tools to see how we can shift policy and programs and everything to build a more socially connected older adult population. So more to come.
So at Aspen, we're not working directly with children. We're not a youth serving organization, but we work with policymakers and systems leaders who are thinking about the system structures, conditions that young people can thrive in. We primarily think about K through 12 education, and so you're talking about kids who are 5 to 18, 19. But of course have an interest in a broader set from like 0 to, I would say, up to 24, really is how we're thinking about it overall. We see a couple of things across the kind of field of education that are successful. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is like the need for connection, and what that means. It changes, it evolves over even the lifespan of just 0 to 18. And so with younger kids, it is more about their individual relationship with a teacher and the opportunity in a classroom to develop social skills. And so in places that have expanded access for public pre-K 3 and 4, you see a lot of this like social, emotional, just skill development, things like conflict resolution. I'm sure a lot of us grew up in the time of like no tattling, which I don't know that people use anymore, but what's behind that is like you should be able to work this out with your friends. You don't just rely on someone else to do it with you. And so places where kids have opportunities to do that frequently, to do it often, and to do it with kids that they have to come back and face the next day is super important. Especially because as they get older, all of a sudden you're faced with like, I can say something online and then never have to like talk to that person again. And so places that organize for young people around that are important. When you see in middle school, it becomes really important for kids to explore their interests. That's where they start developing identity, starting to exercise some independence. Someone talked earlier about being able to walk home from school. And I would say that this is where we see the least effectiveness in how K-12 has adapted to the needs of young people. We all recognize middle school as this incredibly critical point in young people's lives. We've done very little to redesign the way that middle schools work. And so in places where schools are partnering with community organizations and just thinking about like, how do they take the core knowledge they're trying to give to young people, but then give them opportunities to do it in places that they care about. That's where we see some real gains for people, specifically around chronic absenteeism. There's some research that if there's just one thing that the kid likes at school, they'll keep coming. Like even if they have to sit through the other 10 that they hate, if there's that one thing that connects deeply to their interests, that they'll be there and they'll be engaged. And that has longer term impacts, not only for them, but for the other students around them, because that's the challenge kind of with absenteeism. And then when we think about adults or even younger adults, as we would be thinking it, is this opportunity to like identify and use their unique skill set towards like solving common goals or challenges with others in their community. And community can be classroom, school, community church, etc. And so there actually are a lot of high school redesign efforts going on to where they're thinking more about what's the applied knowledge that a young person needs to go and be successful. There's a ton of work right now. A lot of people have been doing it and calling it a lot of different things. But an organization called America Succeeds, it talks about durable skills. And so it's this wheel of skills. And they've been able to get a lot of traction on it because it's driven mostly by workplace needs. But it is about building the skills that you need to build the relationships to thrive in the workplace and beyond. And so where we are seeing high schools and even states as they think about portraits of a graduate and how do we more fully think about what success looks like for young people, where we're starting to do things a little differently. So I would say most of the success comes from places that are broadening the way they're thinking about their goals of education and how they define success, and then learning how to integrate it with some of the core functions that we think about through schools.
Bringing back so many memories of pre-K. I don't know if anyone else had a conference where you could like go outside the classroom and talk through some issue. I would just go out with my friends and we would gab. So but lots of memories. Thanks, Lauren. Fine.
So specific populations.
Yeah, populations, and then just curious, I think in your research specifically around what's working well. I know we've talked a little bit about also trying a lot of things at once, maybe talking a bit
Right,
about
right.
that
Yes,
strategy.
well, first of all, I'll just say a little bit more. I mentioned that the 100% remote workers are more vulnerable to loneliness in the populations. We have been trying to understand, are there certain, even though we think about this as an environmental issue, are there certain types of people more prone to loneliness at work? And you see it, and probably not surprisingly, but more for individual contributors and people who haven't elevated to the managerial ranks. And that's also important to think about. So we're not talking about just CEOs who may not get it, but like the team leaders and the middle managers may have also forgotten what it's like to be a more junior person at work. And so having to encourage them to include those people more and build those social activities. And so Sarah Wright, my colleague and I already mentioned, and I did a study where we were looking at what specific kinds of things can we tell people to do at work to help alleviate the loneliness problem. And we have these 8 different options that a lot of companies have tried. There are things that you're familiar with. It would be like a happy hour or doing a communal free lunch, or just carving out 5 or 10 minutes into a meeting to do chit chat at the beginning. We also looked at doing things more elaborately, like, a whole retreat and having social time there, or doing some wellness programs as a cohort or networking programs, or free coffee, peer building programs. And we asked everybody their likelihood of engaging in these activities. And the options were from I wouldn't go or wouldn't do this at all, to I might do a little bit, to maybe I'd, for a happy hour, I'd stay for most of it, to somebody who was like, yeah, this is my jam, like I'm gonna do this whole thing and really dig into it. And so from that, we were able to calculate their prospective engagement in these activities. And then we cut the data by all these other categories we thought would matter, like gender and age and managerial rank and function and things like that. And we were surprised to find that there were just 3 universally most favored options for building social connection. And the first one was doing a free lunch. So we talked already about the nourishing aspects, right, of social connection, and people recognize that in the workplace too. There's a lot of value to just sitting and eating with someone, and it could be with programming or not. So that was by far, across all categories, the most favorite option. The next one was just taking those 5 or 10 minutes out of a meeting to have chit chat, which again, sometimes can feel kind of artificial and forced, and you want to do it in a way that doesn't feel like you've now just compressed the rest of your agenda, like that you actually have some breathing room where people really can have those conversations, and prompts can be very helpful there, especially if people are online. But people do recognize that's helpful. It's 5 or 10 minutes, but it helps. And then the last one was, you know, the happy hours, which actually surprised me, because you hear so many complaints about happy hours, except for the really young people, I think. So what we learned from that was that a lot of this is not that hard. We don't have to create these, you know, like super fun outings for the whole day that cost tons of money, has tons of logistics involved. If the really important thing is that you're making intentional and regular effort towards these at work. So people want to say that they have these lunches every month, not just once a year. Or, you know, maybe these are quarterly, you know, after hours gatherings at a restaurant nearby, or the meetings happen every week. So thinking about, that's what we learned, is that's really important thing. People want the regular access to these opportunities, and they're pretty universally endorsed across different demographic groups. And so we hope that the companies will use that as a mandate to say, you know, there's no real reason we can't do this. These are all easy, the meeting thing is free, right? And it can be done remotely or in person. So why can't we start doing this more? And that's what we hope the messaging will come out with.
Thanks, Connie. And that brings us to talk a little bit about policy and big P, small p policy, however you want to take it. I don't know if anyone watched the Tonys, but seeing as we are in the room where it happens, right, with Hamilton's 10-year reunion. I think it's just important for us to talk about, you know, opportunity, thinking about policy levers for fostering, advancing social connection. So I'm curious if either of you have thoughts about, you know, within your own sector, how policy plays a role, again, being at the federal level, state, local, or even thinking organizational policies.
So in terms of better measuring who's a high risk, so we've supported the Senior Act with the coalition. And also we think that a national strategy for social connections is important, not unlike Let's Move a long time ago under the Obama administration. What a way to organize entire agencies to be thinking about this issue and what role they play in it. As was mentioned earlier, there is lots of reorganization going around right now, and moves towards block grants and things of that nature. Entire centers at CDC are being eliminated. The Chronic Disease Center, no funding anymore for that. The Injury Center, pretty hit. SAMHSA being moved, but block granted. So there's lots of shifts right now, where we got to keep our eye on the ball of what these programs did and how they might show up again in a new structure, and how we're there to advocate for them, or maybe save some of them if we can, across the board. And then Medicare and Medicaid aren't going anywhere, even though they're being potentially cut. Medicare Advantage is important. The WISE is the single largest provider of the fitness benefit in Medicare Advantage, 7 times, the next 7 providers combined aren't as big. So, and thinking of fitness as actually social connections, important as nutrition is social connection. So we need to be thinking about what that looks like. And then waivers and flexibility in Medicaid and Medicaid managed care, all things that we need to be keeping our eye on, and how this issue plays for that.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're thinking about is gonna happen at the state and local level, not even because of currently what's happening with the Department of Education, but because it's always at the state and local level. That's where the responsibility sits for K-12 education. And so one, you've heard me say it multiple times, we have to broaden what we measure. A lot of states do have these portraits of a graduate, but I have a colleague that refers to them as a flat Stanley. Because they are creative, they have a ton of community engagement. You ask students about what they want, and then they are hung out somewhere, and no systems, policies, or practices are reoriented to meet the goal of the portrait. And so I think that's not every state, but I would say the majority that have a portrait of a graduate. So looking to places like Indiana, where they're thinking about their GPS system and thinking about broader measures, as well as one place that the federal government could lean in is supporting research and development on how to measure the things that we're talking about. So I think that's one. The second is around supporting educator effectiveness. And so I think that is both at the teacher prep level. You heard me mention a bit about it before. We haven't really reorganized how we do teacher preparation. And if you talk to a lot of teachers, both novice and experienced, they say, I'm so unprepared right now for what is happening, and not because of their own efforts, because they've not been given the supports, training, et cetera, that they need, whether they're new teachers or professional development or doing ongoing professional development. that help them orient around connection, et cetera. Continuing to think about how to strengthen school, family, community partnerships. It's something that we talk a lot about. Schools took on an incredible amount of the burden during the pandemic. It's not sustainable for the school, for the leader, for the teacher, for the students. So broadening that. And then also preparing students for civic participation. We talk a lot about math and reading scores in this country. NAEP also looks at civics, and it declined worse than anything else. And so that is a place where a lot of this like identity is formed, where you have opportunities to connect with people around a common goal. And so refocusing on making that part, a predictable part really of someone's K-12 education. And then lastly, connecting learning to real world experiences. And so there's a ton of redesign efforts, like I said, going on in high school, but you can't do school the same till 10th grade and then say, oh wait, we're gonna do it different so that you're now set up for success. Like we're gonna have to keep drilling down, and it's not that we've nailed it on high school redesign yet, but as we're continuing to work, thinking more about what does it mean to have exposure at the middle school level, exploration at the elementary school level, and then all the way down.
Well, I'm thinking about, so like Andrew, you talked about the two main premises of the Action Network was focus on policy and on funding. And I think that both of those have major implications for addressing this issue of corporations. In terms of policy, I would say I have witnessed a major change in the fear factor among C-suite executives about doing or saying the wrong thing these days, publicly. And I do have concerns that somehow social connection or loneliness may become polarizing in some way. And so I think the more that the bipartisan efforts towards addressing this issue can happen in Washington and at the state and local levels, the more it will help companies continue to focus on and address these without worrying about tripping into some sort of challenge and difficulty. And the more their employees will feel okay about speaking up about this too. So that's one. And then I think in terms of funding, you know, there's been conversation today about third spaces, which I understand is really thinking about more of the community actions that can and convening spaces that can happen. But I look at third spaces from where people work. So we think about these days, people work in an office, they work at home, or they work in third spaces. And some of our research has shown that people actually feel the most socially fulfilled working in third spaces versus their office or their home. And that's because for a number of reasons, but one of them is because they're interacting with people outside of the norm that they would see in the office. They're removing a lot of the sort of competitive pressures that can happen among working just with colleagues. They learn new things. They get to be out in the community. Maybe it's working in a coffee shop or a library, or maybe it's working in a co-working space. And so I think too, if there are efforts to fund these kinds of third spaces that have not just a social aspect, but also a place where people can work together and use those and their organizations can support them by funding, for example, for memberships to some of these co-working spaces or other places that they may want to go. I think that's where we can really see a really nice blend too of what's the companies are interested in and what the communities are seeking. Plus, it'll be great for local businesses and other places that people will be out and about in their areas.
On that, I forgot to mention, with regard to building spaces, the new market tax credit is not in the House reconciliation bill, maybe in the Senate. That has been a great way for WISE to build buildings in low income areas, as well as earmarks. And opportunity zones is another one. Again, these are focused on low income areas. There is a bill that was reintroduced called the Youth Sports Facilities Act, which would use Economic Development Administration funding to build more youth sports facilities, which again, we're struggling there with facilities and sites to be able to provide enough. So I think all of those, and I think the new market tax credit, it's multi-use, multi-sector projects that really do well in there. And so that's a great place for that kind of intersectionality, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're talking about, Katie, is also opportunity to bring people together from different socioeconomic backgrounds to support social capital building and economic mobility. So a lot of what we think about as well is when we bring the sectors together. Okay, in our final minute here, maybe just a sentence or two. What's giving you hope right now, you know, as you think about our opportunity and great need to advance social connection across the country?
I feel hope every day when I'm sitting in a room with people like this. And I feel very fortunate that I do get to go out and talk to people on a regular basis. Whether it's I was just at a group in Texas with 300 leaders of a big construction firm and people wanted to talk about these kinds of issues. So I think that's what gives me hope. There are many more of us now focused on this and ready to take some action and to help and see each other.
Even though we're not a youth surveying program, I do get to spend lots of time with young people. We have one of our young people in the back that works at Aspen. And they are what give me hope. I recently last week sat and listened to a young woman who was thinking about how you make technology a tool for connection and less about isolation, and just bringing up so many ideas that I think that people who didn't spend their adolescence with the technology that we just don't even think about. And so young people are like, they're ready to tackle this issue and all the ones that we've talked about all day today. And they're just looking for the right support and structures from us, and so that gives me a ton of hope.
I'd say one, the fact that our movement wants to dive into this work deep for the next 10 years is very exciting to me, because I definitely see this as a big social crisis. And then I would say to the youth point, I should have said already that we have 50 youth governors in town today. The Y does youth and government programs to build the next generation of civic leaders. About 60,000 kids go through that program with high schools every year. And they do go and meet across different, and it is always that group, or we have a youth achievers program. It is always young people that you can find that hope and inspiration in. And I think when you see the youth and government program, you see that they actually will work together to solve problems facing the nation. And that's what we want to see in our elected officials. So yes, that's the hope we see. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Katie, Loren, and Connie, thank you so much for your time this morning. And Andrew, we will kick it back to you.
Wow, absolutely fantastic panel. Thank you so much to all four of you.